Okay.
Gotcha.
So what I'd like to introduce the speaker is, we did this at the last exit talk too, is this is the exit talks in the middle of 2 days, is to introduce ourselves and our potential or actual connection to the Health Equities Initiative on campus. So and then we'll get back to you. So let's get started. I'm Leticia Marquez Magana. I was on the search committee that hired the HEI director and I'm currently the chair of the search committee that's hiring the HEI professor in biology. So,
I'm Jessica Fields. I'm a professor in the sociology department, and I'm on the sociology HEI search committee, and I had UME funding.
I'm Ed McCon, also from the sociology department, and I'm chairing the HEI sociology search.
Robert Harris, professor of biology.
Grace Hardy, in nursing and I'm from Howard. I'm a librarian for the health and biology, and I was on the HEI advisory.
I'm Sarah Cohen. I'm a professor in biology. I work on environmental health things to do using population genetics.
Rick Spicer, professor in biology.
Eric Grubman, professor in biology.
Bruce Mocker, not a professor in biology. Biochemistry.
Diana.
Member of the search committee.
Diana Hsu, assistant professor in biology.
And Cynthia Gomez, director of Health Equity Initiatives.
To say who we are and how we're related to each other, we are.
Mike Goldman, we just met a few minutes ago.
Okay. And so this is Dr. Mountain, and she's going to be telling us today about genetic ancestry and health disparities. She's a candidate in our HEI professor of biology search, and the overall goal of this presentation is to really give us a sense of how you see yourself integrated into the HEI. It's going to be this continuing development. And so I guess I should say a little bit about your background. She received her BS in mathematical sciences at Stanford, her PhD in genetics at Stanford as well, did a postdoctoral fellowship with Montgomery Slacken in IB at UCD, and is coming to us from a professorship at Stanford.
Right. Thank you, Liz. Well, the great thing about this initiative is that much of it is to be created. It's very forward-looking and exciting in that it's not all worked out. And I mean, that's what draws me to science, is working out things that are answering questions that nobody's ever answered before. And this initiative is something also that's going to develop and evolve as far as I can tell from speaking with Cynthia and Matty and others, and that's very exciting. I'm trained in genetics, specifically human population genetics, and in some ways I feel like, well, if you had to decide one field that you would invest in terms of health equity, would it be genetics? And it might not be. But if you're going to team up, I think that genetics should certainly be part of the research plan, the education plan in a health equity initiative program. So I'll be talking a little bit about genetics, but I want to think big picture as well. I really like the term health equity. Health disparities is both, is describing the problem. Health equity is the goal. And again, it's forward thinking. It's a very noble goal. Equity to me means you take, this is a set of photographs from New York Times at the turn of the millennium, and the idea was to represent the ethnic diversity of peoples in 2050. So that's at least one dimension of diversity that's supposed to be represented in this collage. And there are other dimensions of diversity that we may also care about in terms of health equity. We may care about economic diversity and so on. But I'll focus a bit more on racial and ethnic diversity in thinking about health equity today. Much of our understanding of disparities comes from work by the CDC. They do these great reports every year, and you can't get a start without having basic numbers. And I actually enjoy looking through these reports and going, oh my goodness, we have this going on here at this rate, and that's changed this much over this much time. So it's a fascinating set of reports. And kind of, I pulled a trait out of a hat. And it's not quite out of a hat, it's a special feature for the 2006 report from the CDC. And that feature is pain. And it kind of bothers me that pain is a bit trendy right now. But it's trendy for a reason. Here, there's a note that patterns of self-reported pain vary considerably by age, by sex, race and ethnicity, and poverty. Between 1999 and 2002, over a quarter of Americans who are over the age of 20 reported that they had a problem with pain that has persisted for more than 24 hours. That is within the last month. So pain is something that does have, it has an economic impact in terms of reduced work days and so on. It's clearly something at the forefront of thinking in terms of health. It's also, I don't know if any of you know this name, Keith Whaley has been a visiting scholar at Stanford at the Center for Behavioral Studies. And he is a professor of history, has done a number of books looking at science and history of science. And just to sort of corroborate this emphasis on pain these days, he is writing a book called Politics of Pain that looks at different perceptions of pain across cultures, and a fascinating topic. And so it's in the air. Obviously, there have been pain centers for a number of years that have really focused on something that was really in a corner for previous decades. So it's something that's out in front. And one of the summaries in the CDC 2006 report is looking at one type of pain, that is severe headache and migraine. And probably all of you here, because 25% of people report dealing with pain, probably most people here know somebody or even have had one of those years of a bad year with pain. But one of the dimensions that they look at is severe headache and migraine, and what we see here is fairly even frequencies across some groups. About 15% of individuals who identify or have been identified as Hispanic or Latino report severe headache or migraine. White individuals identifying as white and not Hispanic, or African American and not Hispanic, also reported similar frequencies of severe headache or migraine. And individuals self-reporting as Asian reported at a lower rate. American Indian and Alaska Native category, people who are affiliated with that group, reported somewhat more. And so there are differences, and you might say, well, are those significant differences? And that's certainly a question. And what are the factors? Now, I'll go back 70 years, 75 years to early studies of the inheritance of migraine. Severe headache, I guess, would be included there. And this is a paper from 1932 where the authors look at pedigrees. And so this is a family tree, and the dark circles indicate that individuals report some kind of allergy or migraine. And here the M's indicate migraine. Some individuals have migraine plus eczema, some other kind of allergic reaction. And so they're thinking here, well, there's an inheritance to this, there's a genetic component. And so that's the thinking of 70 years ago. there hasn't been a lot learned in terms of actual genes. There is at least one case where there's a role for genes in some migraine cases. But I don't know that we've come that much further than saying, wow, it travels in families, often with other allergic type traits. So the thinking about genes, and so they argue, well, it doesn't look like a simple inheritance. It doesn't look like one gene that really we call penetrant, that guarantees that someone gets migraine because it seems to kind of skip generations, or it's not doing so in this family, but it is in others. And so we can't quite tell how it's inherited, but we think it's one gene playing a big role. So that was the thinking 70 years ago. We haven't found that gene, and so that's kind of where we stand now. Interestingly enough, this is looking at income, so we're ignoring race and ethnicity for the moment. I've talked about migraine, shown you one diagram for migraine. Here, what we see is, well, it's certainly not only genetics, even though in 1932 there was a sense, oh, genetics is the story here. So we have 3 different colors here. The blue represents individuals who are living below the poverty line. Red is intermediate, where you're between 100 and 200% of the poverty level. And here is the wealthier category. And interestingly, for all 3 of the pain measurements they looked at, there's a real clear trend. So one way you get health equity is you just boost everybody's income. Obviously, that's not the solution, but that would be the naive interpretation here. But interestingly, it's the same pattern across all these traits, even though the biology of these might be distinct. So clearly, social factors are playing a role, unless you believe that income has a genetic basis. And there are people out there who will espouse that argument. They tend to be shoved off in a corner, and because it's clear that there are social factors playing a role here. So it's certainly not only genetics. But let's take a look now, again, at race and ethnicity, not just for migraine, which is in the pale blue here, as we saw before. We saw the exact same pale blue columns. Let's look at the other types of pain that have been examined here. And what we see is that in all 3 of these cases, we see a difference in that in all 3 cases, the individuals affiliated with the Asian group report lower frequencies of the pain, and individuals affiliated with American Indians or Alaska Native populations report higher levels. Okay, so do we call this a health disparity? Maybe, because we see this fairly strong trend, a consistent trend with this group tends to have lower reported incidence, and this group tends to have higher reported incidence. Now, there are findings, obviously, for a number of other traits. So this is certainly not my area of specialty, but I thought it would be something, it's broad. There are multiple factors, as I've said. Genes have been suggested as playing a role, and we know in at least some families they do play a role, but income clearly plays a role. And it turns out those income diagrams, they're the same for all 3 of these dimensions of pain. So what I want to do is go back and think about, well, what do we consider when we think about health disparities? So I'm putting health in yellow down here, and by health I mean various dimensions of health: physical, mental, and emotional. We've got in the other corner an individual's racial and ethnic identity. I'll come back to race, like some thoughts and so on race and ethnicity later, but right now we're just going to put that up as these are labels. And what are the connections between the two? Why would we see any kind of correlation or something that maps one of these onto the other? And I believe all of you have in your mind, you know, either in words or pictures, I do it in pictures and words, of what could be the factors here. And obviously people do very sophisticated analysis, but I thought it would be nice just for me to lay this out in my terms today. First of all, I actually see health as a bit distinct from biological and psychological state. You have physical, physiological, mental, and emotional states, and the health is maybe a little bit more on what you would report, and not necessarily identical to your state. So we step back from health a little bit. And certainly we have to consider that an individual's environment plays a role in, has an influence on biological and psychological states. That environment is a really complex thing. It's one word that encompasses all kinds of types of dimensions of the environment. We can't ignore that. An individual's behavior is at the center of this diagram. And certainly an individual's behavior can influence his or her biological, psychological state. And behavior, again, encompasses a wide range of activities and so on. Diet, physical activities, response to stress, healthcare utilization, and there are many more that we could list. Now, I'm not going to ignore genes. There certainly is plenty of evidence that genes can influence our biological and psychological state. Now, very often I find that people lump biology and genes together. And so that, to me, they are very, very different things. Biology is influenced by very many factors, environmental and behavioral factors. Genes are just one influence on biology, and so it's important to keep those separate in my mind. Environment can influence your behavior. Your economic environment might certainly influence your behavior. Genes, I'm missing. I put culture in here. I've been in an anthropology department for a while. We think a lot about culture. And there can be a lot of arguments about what culture is. But what I'm focusing on here are things that are inherited from ancestors, that practices and so on. So a very kind of simplistic view of culture, but something that's inherited from ancestors that, and those practices may actually have quite an influence on behavior. And I'm drawing a line here between racial and ethnic identity and ancestry. I'll come back to that a little bit. There's not necessarily a strong link here, but the research that's come out in recent years suggests that there's a correspondence, nothing causal, but there is a relationship between who your ancestors were and the identity that you that many people indicate. There's a link. We have a lot of links in here, certainly between the environment, where you live may influence how you identify yourself, and there are links here. So all these arrows are double-ended. Things may go back and forth, and so really we end up with quite a complex diagram. But I think it's critical to have something like this as a basis for discussion when we're trying to bring people together from different disciplines. And even though I focus on this part of the diagram more than other parts, I feel that it's important for me to be aware and considering all these other dimensions of the problem. I'd love to see how other people, just random people do something like this chart and how different it would be. I suspect there'd be a lot of overlap with other people, but I'd love to see if other people have radically different views of this. So I said I'd say a little bit more about race and ethnicity, and because I have found, and it's not as much of a problem now, but in the past, at times, mentioning race and ethnicity in the same sentence as genetics can make people nervous. So I actually, because of that, with Barbara Koenig, who was at Stanford as a medical anthropologist, so she and I have very different training, we would have discussions. We were writing a paper together, and we would kind of butt heads over terminology and that kind of thing. And we decided, but we could reach an understanding, and that was exciting. When cross disciplines, because my training is more in genetics than in the social sciences. But when you can talk with people in other disciplines about problems like, is it okay to talk about race and ethnicity in the context of genetic research? So that felt great when we would make some headway. And we decided, well, why don't we bring in other people? Why don't we bring in other geneticists and psychologists and historians who are interested in race and ethnicity, and bring them together to try to communicate across this divide. The reason I did this is because I was talking to other geneticists on one hand who said the social scientists are trying to shut down science by saying we can't, scientists cannot use any racial and ethnic labels. And the social scientists, on the other hand, are saying those scientists are reifying those labels, meaning they're giving them more meaning than they should have. And they shouldn't be doing that because they are going to increase discrimination by using the labels. And so I was talking to both and saying, well, we've got to come together and try to figure out how to quit throwing stones and move forward. And so we had, part of this is just to let you know I've had kind of a long-standing interest in this problem. So Barbara and I did get people together, and we've been revising a paper where we have a joint statement coming out of these, actually multiple groups. It's at least two groups. It's geneticists and social scientists, but each of those is subdivided. Coming together and saying what are the fears people have, and what are some things we agree on. We might disagree on some things. And it turns out there's not a lot of disagreement. The stone throwing comes out of fears, and once you ameliorate those fears, people quit being so critical of the other. I've also played a role at NIH in discussing these racial and ethnic labels, all to do with genetics research. And I mean, that's been something that NIH has been very concerned about over the last few years. And it's been great to be involved and listen. Again, it's listening, it's interdisciplinary. You have people from various fields coming together to try to figure out how we talk about this kind of research. More recently, I've become involved for a couple of reasons, partly because I'm interested in populations that have ancestry from various parts of the world. And the Hispanic or Latino populations of the Americas have ancestry, we know, that dates indigenously to the Americas, goes back to Africa and back to Europe. So, and so I've been part with Fernando Arena has organized these workshops on cancer epidemiology and trying to figure out if there's a role for genes in the different incidence of various cancers in Latino populations versus other populations. So again, a look at race and ethnicity in the context of genetics. And this specifically has been health focused. So one of the tricks here is what do we mean by race and ethnicity? And boy, you go to different circles and there are very different views on what those terms mean. And so in a paper a couple of years ago with Neil Reisch, we said, well, we've got to define what we mean by these terms. And first I defined, this was my, I cared a lot about the words here. And so we negotiated the wording, but I defined a social category as something that's determined by social factors. It's hard to do this in a room of sociologists and experts, but we do our best, right? We do our best. As geneticists, we've got to try to define our terms, and we probably step on the toes of others doing so. And I also, coming out of math, you always define your terms, right? I was originally in math, and you have to define everything. So an individual I define is associated with a category based on a set of socially negotiated criteria. And given this definition of a social category, race, in my mind, race and ethnicity are social categories. They're socially negotiated, but I add this phrase here at the end. Some of the inclusion criteria, some of the things that are socially negotiated that kind of we all agree on, that allow people to put themselves in one category or another, or allow another person to kind of lump someone into a category, may be biological. And that could be taken different ways. It could be some feature, skin color, that we include as, well, okay, we think about that as part of how we categorize somebody. It may not be anything to do, when people self-identify, skin color may play less of a role. But there are cases when people identify others as being parts of different race or ethnicity categories. There may be biological criteria. And what this phrase does is suddenly give a way that there might be a correspondent, some biology linked to race and ethnicity. And I felt that was important. I remember speaking with undergrads a few years ago, and the rhetoric then was, by geneticists, was most variation is within human groups, there's no biological basis for race. Okay, that was the rhetoric, and that statement was said again and again and again. But the students did not believe it. They just thought scientists were lying. Okay, so if you want credibility, you have to go beyond that rhetoric. And so this is kind of opening up the door to correlations, but it's socially negotiated, and even skin color. That's not, nobody uses just skin color to think about race and ethnicity. That I know.
Question.
Yes.
Where does national origin fit in this? Because I think a lot of people think about that when they consider race and ethnicity.
Right. I often think of geographic origin, but when we talk about race and ethnicity, sometimes people don't actually have a national, if you think of African Americans, there's a continental origin. So the question of national origin plays out differently for different groups. And so that's something, I haven't discussed that much with people, but I have thought about that, and I think right now for Europeans, national origin is a big deal. And a lot of the people who are doing the genetics, they want to know, well, where in Europe are my ancestors from? And you can do that with a Y chromosome and a mitochondrial DNA. There are companies that are working hard to tell you where exactly your ancestors came from. Now, African Americans are actually starting to learn about national origin through genetic analysis, because the Y chromosome and mitochondrial parts of our genomes actually can be traced back to different parts of Africa. And to me, I can imagine that that's incredible to go from, well, I know I have some African ancestry too. My goodness, it traces back to Ghana or Angola. I think it's a wonderful part, and it's actually attracted many people to genetics who otherwise have not been interested in genetics. So the question of national origin is all part of this. For me, national origin is a set of overlapping categories that they may not be quite as socially negotiated, but I mean, what do I emphasize of my ancestry? English more than Irish? Is that because, you know, my father was so denigrating of the Irish, or, what? There are plenty of trends in terms of national origin as well. What part do you emphasize? So I think you can say some of the same things about national origin. Part of this, anthropology has spent a lot of time trying to look at head shape and skull shape and try to figure out whether people are Northern European or Southern European, and it's a lot of very racist kind of rhetoric around that. And I'm not as familiar with that, except to know that it exists. But so that gets a little tricky when you're starting to try to define, go the other direction. This is not reversible. You can't go from the biology to the race and ethnicity because of the social negotiation. And the next point I want to note is that the extent to which these labels correlate with biological traits is going to shift through time and across the labels themselves. The labels that people use shift all the time. Who's a minority obviously has shifted quite a bit in the history of this country. And so we cannot go from the biology and say, aha, if you have this biology or this genetics, that means you have this race or ethnicity. But sometimes we can, there may still be correlation. And the correlation that we see, some of it is the outcome of population history. And this is where much of my research comes in, because I care very much about characterizing human genetic variation, the whole global pattern of it in terms of migration history. How, it turns out that the pattern of variation observed on the planet mirrors, this figure mirrors human migrations. Starting out in Africa, somewhere between 100 and let's say 60,000 years ago, we start having diversification within Africa. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. That's going to be the focus of my research talk tomorrow. And much more recently, say on the order of 50 to 60,000 years, we have people moving out quite early to Australia, somewhat more recently into Europe, and then even more recently down into the Americas. And that's obviously a big debate. Is it 15,000 years ago or 35,000 years ago that people moved here? And most of the genetic data suggests it's more recent. It could be that people came down early, but they didn't leave any genes. They didn't actually survive to leave genes to the present day. So you could have had early migrations that are not picked up by genetic studies today. So the pattern of human genetic variation maps onto these human migrations, but linguistics maps on very crudely to these migration patterns as well, in that the languages, which may have evolved in the last 5 to 15,000 years, happen in various geographic locations. And so even though the timing of these migrations isn't at the same scale as linguistic evolution, the geography leads to a correspondence there. And this is just, I'm a picture person. And so to make that same statement with a picture, we can imagine two different islands. And we have, one island has, this is a mountain range, in case you didn't recognize it. This is maybe a little bit of a barrier, but hardly a barrier, so that here we have a gradient from bright yellow to orange, and this could be a gradient in terms of genetics, it could be a cultural gradient, the frequency with which groups carry out some practice. It could be a linguistic gradient in terms of frequency of use of a particular term. Here we have the alternative simple model, all oversimplified of course, where we have two groups that are very much isolated. Now, if that's the case, you may see differentiation not just in terms of genetics, but also in terms of linguistics and cultural practices as well. So this is why we might end up with correlations between genetics, culture, language, and so on, even without any causal relationships between those. It's just that subdivision will influence differentiation of all the many dimensions of human diversity. So that's why we sometimes see correspondence between genetics and other factors. And you know, you can imagine health if you have infectious disease in one area, not another. Again, the most dimensions of human diversity you might see accentuated when you have a strong barrier. It's supposed to be a mountain range that is virtually impassable. Then you see differentiation, which I've indicated here by all red versus all yellow, instead of the gradient that we see here when there's less isolation. So so when we think about human migration patterns and geography has played a role, so that peoples here speak quite a different set of languages from here, and so on. And the genetics maps on roughly to those. So I'm going to say a little bit more about genes now, and tackle head-on a subject that I think has been a taboo. And there's even a book called Taboo. It's about sports and genes, and some of that may have some grounding in science. A lot of it is, somebody has a belief and they want to get it across. But it's underlying the fears. What I've discovered in talking to people from, especially social sciences, is that there's a lot of fear that when people link genetics and race and ethnicity, they're going to start talking about IQ, going back to the bell curve, and that so there's a lot of discomfort with thinking about athletic ability, IQ. There are some other hot button topics, and group differences. And so I felt like, well, let's be systematic about it. We can talk about it. We just need to be careful in the way we discuss this. So with Neil, and this is where I define those social categories and so on. I wrote this paper, and it's supposed to kind of be a guide to thinking about genetic contributions to phenotypic differences between racial and ethnic groups. And by phenotypic differences, I mean anything that you can measure about a person. We toss that word around, but let's just say it's something measurable, something observable about people. So when you see differences between groups, when can you say there's a genetic basis? Because there are people who are dying to do this. They're working really hard to show that IQ differences between populations have a genetic basis. And they are driven to do it. They've been trying for 30 plus years or more. And so what we did was we thought about presenting a couple of examples. And this is a case of absolute pitch, the ability to produce a pitch right on target. I don't have it, so I can't do a demonstration. But here we imagine that we have two populations, and this could even be two ethnic groups or two groups of individuals, one of which has early musical training, that's before the age of 6, and the other group, for whatever cultural reasons or who knows why, little or no early musical training. And what is seen, actually observed, is that for the group with no early musical training, you have a distribution of a score in terms of your ability to produce absolute pitch, and it's the red distribution here, which really is very flat down here, and very few people without that early musical training can score highly on this test of absolute pitch. Once you look at another group, early musical training radically changes the distribution so that you have suddenly a cluster of individuals out here who, without that training, clearly would not have done so well. So in terms of the heritability, which is sometimes used to think about the role of genes, you, in a group with musical training, you end up showing high heritability, and yet there's an environmental basis for the group difference. That is, the difference between the two distributions here, the blue and the red, is because of this musical training. So we wanted to show a case where you can have high heritability within groups, but still environment causes the group difference. There's the alternative possibility where we have something a bit opposite, and this is taste sensitivity to something called PTC. And usually in classes I let everyone try it out and discover whether or not they are able to taste this, have the bitter taste on of this chemical. And what we find is that sensitivity here is quite high among Native Americans, for all Native Americans. And here you have, among the Europeans in red, it's more broadly distributed. And it turns out that there's a known gene that makes you taste. It contributes to your ability to taste this substance. But the variant that is prevents you tasting is found only in the Europeans. And so here, genetic variation contributes within the red or the European group here. But when you look within the Native Americans, there doesn't seem to be any role for genes. And so the difference between the groups, the Native American and European group, does have a genetic basis, because there's a different frequency. Now, it doesn't mean that all the Europeans are here and all the Native Americans are here, but there is a group difference here. But the only way we know this is that we know the gene that allows people to taste or not to taste that specific chemical substance. It doesn't have an impact, much of an impact, if any, on behavior or health or anything. It's just one of those quirky genetic phenotypes. So I won't go into all the details here, but our goal was to say, well, how can you really demonstrate that there's a role for genes in group differences? You've got to be very careful, because distributions that look like their genes might play a role can fool you. And the methods people use, and I'm sure you can't see these, but I'll just state them. People look at twin studies, familial correlations, but those can be very misleading in terms of the role for genes. DNA analysis, sometimes you can pick up signals, but that also can be incomplete. Admixture analysis, where you look at populations that have mixed geographic ancestry, which includes, in this country, African Americans, some Hispanic groups. You might be able to look at those populations, and if you identify a specific region, you might be able to argue that it is the cause of group differences. But it is very challenging. So to really demonstrate that you've found a genetic basis. And so people have been trying to do this for 30-odd years, and what we've tried to do is to be systematic about it and say, well, simply doing twin studies, you're not going to convince me. But not ruling out the possibility. And I think we've got to be rational here. Nobody likes, people are afraid that there is a genetic basis to group differences in all kinds of things, behavior. You've heard stories about violence studies and so on, where people have suggested there might be genes. There are all kinds of suggestions out there for where genes play roles, and by these criteria, none of them has been actually supported. But we're not ruling out the possibility that in the future, our understanding of genetics might show that, well, this gene might play a little, the frequency of this gene here is higher than here, and that plays some role in some ability or something like that. We're not ruling out kind of irrational about it. So, okay, going back to health equity, I want to focus again on genes. And I'm going now to say a little bit about some research I've been doing very recently that ties directly into genetic differences and even health disparities. So this is an area where the future is there's a lot of growth in thinking about diagnosis and treatment and genes. So when I talk about genetic variation, it's really just subtle differences in frequency of some variant. So let's say we have a sequence here, CCAATTGG, another sequence CCAATAGG. Very small difference. You've got 3 billion nucleotides per copy of your genome. You've got one difference shown here, a T versus an A. Let's imagine that in these are 4 populations from Tanzania that I've worked with, and this is fictional data, but this is the kind of data we look at where the blue, the second variant, is at 23% frequency here, 34% frequency here, 40 here, and 36 there. These are subtle differences, but these are the kinds of differences that geneticists are looking at. Very rarely do you find something that's very frequent in one group and rare in another. It's not unheard of, but it's more rare. Most people are looking at small differences. And so now I'm going to, the context of this research I've been doing is bone marrow transplants. And these data are from the CIBMTR, Center for International Blood and Marrow Transplant Research. And it turns out that, so these are percentages, and again, these labels, why do I use these labels? I don't do them out of choice. It's because so many data have been collected using these labels. We, as a nation, we haven't managed to go beyond these labels. Do we throw all the data out because we don't like these labels? I'm reluctant to, because there's information here, and I think this research I'm showing here, we can use them, we can get something out of them. So 71% of bone marrow transplants are from, I tend to use the European ancestry instead of Caucasian, but that's the label they use here, are from this should say donor race. These are donor races, and this is a recipient race here. So 71% are from a Caucasian to Caucasian, 5% are from a Hispanic individual to a Caucasian individual, and so on. Most of the numbers here are very small. African American to African American is 5%. And so the total fraction of recipients is close to 85%, which is higher than the representation of that group in the U.S. So there is a bias, some bias in terms of who gets bone marrow transplants. And there are a variety of reasons for why Europeans would end up getting more transplants. Part of the story is the challenge of finding donors for people in other groups. There's biology here.
Excuse me, is it
Yeah.
blood and bone marrow or just bone marrow?
This one is blood and bone marrow, this particular chart.
It's kind of surprising.
Yeah.
It's blood replacement? It's not just an ordinary transfusion?
No. It's not a, right. You think of it as the typical, what you think of as bone marrow transplant. Yeah. It's all transplants. It depends on what kind of cells they use, so sometimes they call it blood. Okay, so so I'm going to now talk about a test that is used in cases of transplants. This test is designed to pick up when the host cells are regrowing again. This is not what you want. As a patient, you want your transplant cells to take over your own population. And if your own cells are growing back, then cancer is growing back as well. So it's important to have highly sensitive tests to pick up when a few of your cells are starting to come back, if that happens. So this is post-transplantation. You're the